Hey everyone, so this video is about the various communication booms that we've had as a nation that have led to increased access to media and news sources. Now back in the early days of the Republic, partisan press was the standard of the day, and that meant that the newspapers, which newspapers were the only option then, were heavily negative about particular candidates or parties. And that led to strong negative feelings amongst the public. It also led to large-scale misinformation because the public, not having access to other sources, really were limited in their opportunities to learn new information. And so the partisan press, I know a lot of people talk about the partisan press now, but holy smokes, it was nothing compared to what we were talking about a couple hundred years ago. Probably the ugliest mudslinging in any presidential election happened between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in their competitions against one another. It claimed that Jefferson had children with a slave. Totally true. A woman held in slavery, actually a girl. He was in his 50s, she was 14. Gross crime. They had many, many children together. And the discussions about Adams were that he was like a king and that he boiled babies alive and ate them for breakfast. So we're talking like levels of ridiculous. But the partisan press gave way to what was called yellow journalism. And yellow journalism persisted throughout the latter part of the 1800s. The goal of yellow journalism was to sell more papers. It was referred to as the era of yellow journalism because of a tech boom. So there was a technology advancement that allowed printing papers, newspapers, more cheaply and more readily. And they had a yellow kind of sheen to them, so hence the name yellow journalism. But the public was not as interested in purchasing these new yellow newspapers because they were clearly of an inferior quality. And they recognized that, so they weren't willing to pay the same price. They were willing to pay half price. But the problem is, think about supply and demand, okay? Those of you who have taken economics will know that if people are less willing to buy something, then you've got to drop your price on that. So they halved the price, but that meant that they had to double their readership. And so news agencies began creating more and more sensationalized stories. So if it was very tabloid-esque, then it would be more likely to print because it would be more likely to sell. The public also was at a disadvantage because education rates were low, and we didn't know that the moon, wasn't made of green cheese. And so if we saw an interesting or exciting story, then you were more likely to buy the newspaper itself. And so you had major news agencies of the day really competing with one another over who could sell the most newspapers. William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer actually got into a competition. They're different publishing agencies. Who can sell the most newspapers? And then it became who can one-up one another with the most sensational story. And that led to a major disaster, a really spectacular catastrophe. All right, so it's the 1890s. Spain has invaded Cuba, which is 90 miles south of Florida. And the United States is not okay with this. We wanted to, well, if anybody was going to invade Cuba, it was going to be us, okay? That was our foreign policy stance at the time. And so there are several battleships sent to bottle up the Havana harbor. And one of the battleships, the USS Maine, sitting in the harbor, boom, explodes. And this was the kind of beginning of the end of the era of yellow journalism. And that's because newspapers reported the explosion of the Maine as having been perpetrated by the Spanish forces in Cuba. Well, if you blow up an American warship, that is an act of war. And that means that we are going to war. Now, the individual reporters who were stationed in Cuba were cabling back to their news agencies, there's nothing going on here. There is no war. Nobody is doing anything in terms of war activities. The Spanish don't appear to know anything about this. And Hearst's agency channeled back, if you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. And so pictures were sent that showed the photographs of the USS Maine floating, the pieces floating in the harbor in Havana, and the public was outraged. They saw this printed on every newspaper, and the headlines were that the Spanish attack a peaceful ship inside or in the Havana harbor, and the public demanded war, and we ended up going to war over this, the Spanish-American War. From 1892 to 1896. And at that point, the news agencies looked at each other and realized, holy smokes, we've gone too far, way too far. And so they dialed it back. This is what leads us into the era of modern journalism, which is where we are now. And modern journalism is marked by several tech booms. Radio became readily available to houses across the country. By the Great Depression, even though it was the Great Depression, 90% of American homes could afford a radio. And so that brought sound to the public, or brought it directly into their living rooms. You can see a picture on the right. This is a vintage photo from the 30s of a family gathered around their radio. They have quite a nice radio with a phonograph there. And you can see that there are members of different generations presented in the photograph, which was pretty typical. This became kind of a family thing. You would gather around the radio to listen to the news in the evening, and you would also listen to entertainment shows, that kind of thing, like the pre-runner of Saturday morning cartoons. And so radio was the chief method of communication utilized by all agencies and the government as well. President Roosevelt, FDR, who was president during the Great Depression and World War II, two particularly trying times in American history, was quite famous for using his fireside chats. He would sit and record a message to the public via radio, and the public would come together and listen to that. The idea was to bolster morality during insecure times. It was very effective. Television came on the scene in the 1950s, and by the mid-1960s, almost every American home had a television set. We were starting to see that unique element of technology getting cheaper over time, and so televisions became readily affordable by the late 60s, and then, of course, color television came in as well. Television came with its disadvantages, though. We don't publicize war dead returning to the United States, and we don't publicize war activity that is happening overseas. We cannot watch that on TV. You can't watch it on the internet either, but that's because we watched the Vietnam War on television live, as it was recorded and sent later. We didn't live stream things at the time. And that led to decreasing morale for the war effort, which was not the goal of the American government. And so the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, required that television not show those kinds of images. And so that has been a significant change that we've seen due to the advent of technology. Just because we can have that access doesn't mean that we get to have that access. The internet, which really it came about in the 80s, late 90s, but it did not really become publicly available until the turn of the century. And it's something that has been uniquely part of Gen Z's lifestyle because it's something you've always had. We are technically still in the age of TV in terms of how people access their news. More people still access their news via television than they do via internet. That is rapidly changing, of course, and that is because seniors still use television. They're more comfortable with that. But as you guys become the dominant generation, then the age of the internet will be fully in play. And the internet gives us multiple options. It also gives us multiple challenges because we have so many options and resources. This proliferation of news sources over time has led to a significant increase in news fatigue. And that also has indicated more misinformation and lack of information than we've seen before. The facts are out there. It's harder to find them, but they are out there. You can look for direct sources. I always strongly recommend looking for the original source. If you hear so-and-so said something on the floor of the Senate, well, there's no way to verify it. Sure there is. C-SPAN. Okay, you can watch the actual recordings live, okay? Such and such is on somebody's policy, and I don't agree with that. Okay, check out their website. And so there are options there. That's the original source. So I strongly recommend checking out original sources when you are challenged or feeling frustrated about something that you've seen online.